Good morning. I hope everybody's having a good day, and I hope everybody is enjoying the conclusion here of Ordinary Grace. Friday, um, for the writing element, um, the writing lab, there'll be another video for people to watch, but this is, I think, my last presentation on Ordinary Grace. Quick reminder of what's coming up. Group A is in class today. Friday, we have Writing Lab C. That's Melissa, Morgan, Brady, and Josh. Remember, in the real world, half of life is just showing up. In Writing Labs, all of life is just showing up. Monday, Group B, we have the quiz over Ordinary Grace, and I will probably start talking about some background information for the novel Trail of Lightning. Notice that Group A will be in class on Wednesday. We should be to page 64. I'm going to warn you right now that Trail of Lightning will be, I will not be following the plot quite as much as I probably did here with Ordinary Grace. And then next Friday is Writing Lab D. That's Aaron, Jonah, Dalen, and Rachel. And again, we'll be working on Trail of Lightning. That's the final book, and we'll be wrapping things up. Okay, let's take a look at what's going to happen today. I want to talk about memory. I think there's a great quotation about memory. I believe talking about wisdom would be an important element of this book as well, because remember, a coming of age novel involves the person going from innocence to wisdom. We're going to talk about grace because that's the title of the book. And I want to talk about the solution and foreshadowing. And I'm going to warn you right now, there's one part about the solution that's not going to be on the slides that I'm just going to talk about. So please kind of pay attention. As we talk about memory, what I know from my studies is that there is no such thing as a true event. I've highlighted that part because I do think that we have to look at the idea of true not just as factual. And I think true can also be how we interpret all of the events. And so when he is putting that into context, I think if you look at the second bolded thing, some people recall things differently. Jake and my father recall things I don't. And what we remember together, we often remember differently. I think this idea of memory being sort of a fickle thing is important. And I think there's a link between memory and truth. And as we keep going here, the idea that there's memories we don't share, and people don't speak of that summer, perhaps because the memories are too harsh. But I do think just this idea of there's no such thing as a true event because people remember things differently, and some people recall certain key facts, other people don't recall them at all. Wisdom. I think there's college age Frank, who is different than the Frank of the novel. And there's this piece of wisdom about they are never far from us, you know. Who, I asked. The dead. They're no more than a breath. You let the last one go and you're with them again. And I think he was thinking that this was all about Redstone. But as he grows older, you'll see that with the headstones pressed close around, reminding me of Warren Redstone's parting wisdom, which I understand now, not know now, sorry about the typo. The dead are never far from us. They're in our hearts and on our minds, and in the end, all that separates us from them is a single breath, one final puff of air. Older Frank understands that it's all about us, and that, yes, one of the certainties, one of the wisdoms, pieces of wisdom we come to is that all of us are going to die, and all of us are going to, be in the same state as those who passed on before us. There's some connections I want to make here. I think one of my favorite novels of all time is Things Fall Apart. And in Things Fall Apart, there's this passage that's up on screen about the land of the living was not far removed from the domain of the ancestors. And I think this idea of the ancestors and being close to people is what Redstone was kind of getting to. And then there's a sentence at the conclusion of the first paragraph: a man's life from birth to death was a series of transition rites which brought him nearer and nearer his ancestors. If you look back to the quotation, you'll notice that the one where he was talking about it was wisdom for all of us, you'll notice that he is amongst the headstones. It's one of the transition rites where we have the funeral service. At the same time, we do have this idea of perhaps we don't always remember things. If you look at the middle of this quotation, along the cold hallway behind him hung the portraits of forebears only dimly known to him, and all framed in glass and dimly lit above the narrow wainscoting. One culture, the one for in Africa from Things Fall Apart, the dead are never very far. There's transition rites. In this American novel, people are dimly remembered. And I think someplace within Ordinary Grace is sort of a medium, getting to the middle of all of that. The idea that they're never far from us, it's just one breath away. And I think that's one of the pieces of wisdom that Redstone departed, that Frank, as an older man, has understood. And I think it's kind of one of the key things to the novel, along with memory, along with grace. And then there's family. I didn't put that in the preview. Bound by love, by history, by circumstances, and by the awful grace of God. Now, again, when we talk about this, we're talking about grace at 3 or 4 levels, and we're going to pick that up here pretty quick. In fact, I think that's the next slide. The first time, we talked about grace in the definition of one of the first presentations, and the ordinary grace was just that little table prayer. And it became so ordinary that it was unforgettable. And I think when we look at grace, there are a lot of ordinary instances in this novel where grace is happening. Gus taking them to get a root beer. Those sorts of things are ordinary little bits of grace that perhaps people have no reason to remember, but they do. Just as this table grace was an ordinary piece of grace. And then the ordinary grace all of a sudden became an ordinary miracle. He said it without stuttering. Jake then takes a step further and says that this flawless grace was a gift from the divine and took it as a sign that the drums would survive. That, I think, is an important element. So now we go from ordinary to miraculous. And then I think there are just a ton of questions. Is the grace in this novel awful because it leads to wisdom? Because of all of the horrific events, the murder of a sister, the train killing Bobby Doyle, the death of the itinerant? Is it miraculous because everybody survives? And they perhaps would not have survived without that simple prayer? Or is it ordinary because it's an everyday thing most people fail to notice? I think these are key questions. In the Henrietta Lacks book, I talked about the buffered self and the open self. I think that these are questions that tie into that buffered self and that open self as well. One of the problems some people might have with this novel is the fact that Lies was the murderer or the killer. We can argue premeditation or not. But that Lies was the killer. And one of the things I think people might take offense at is Lies was perhaps autistic. Lies couldn't speak. She, you know, those sorts of things. And why have the person who's autistic? Why have the person who's suffering from that condition be the murderer? Some people might be upset at that. And I think that that's a fair thing, and that's something you can probably talk about in the review. But I think that there's a question of when readers should have guessed. And we talked about clues being presented early. If you look at pages 109 through 111, notice that Lies kept the crowbar. Notice that her arms are described as very well muscled. And notice that she's violent and angry when she gets touched. And notice that term demon light. Now, perhaps you want to argue that I'm reading too much into this one passage, that it is all just happening. But I think it's important to remember that Kruger has written tons of books. He's got the whole mystery series that are excellent. If you want to read them, I think go for it. He's written another book called Tender Mercies that is in the same vein as Ordinary Grace. And I think Kruger is a person who follows the law laid down by a concept called Chekhov's gun. And Chekhov's gun, and I've quoted this from Now Novel, is a concept that describes how every element of a story or a novel should contribute to the whole. It comes from Anton Chekhov's famous book writing advice. If in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, don't put it there. If you're going to put the crowbar in Liza's hands, if you're going to have her have well-muscled arms, and if you're going to have her swinging the crowbar violently, then have the payoff. And so, whether you think it was the best, she's the best person to be the killer or not, whether you find that offensive because she is the person with autism, that's different than the fact that it got set up. And as we were reading, we perhaps read over that part about the well-muscled arms and about keeping the crowbar for herself and about swinging it violently, and even the hint that it would have crushed his skull. He's following the rule, and he put it in there, and it paid off. Daily writing, no surprise. One paragraph of your review and place it in the folder. I'm going to do my best to have them all finished up by I'll start looking at them on Friday. I want to have them all finished up by Monday so that you can use the comments I make in that paragraph before the final paper is due on Wednesday. Hope everybody has a good day, and I'll see some of you in class on Friday, and I'll see more of you in class on Monday as we have the quiz and we start Trail of Lightning.